When I was younger, I was considered one of the popular girls. You would think that this would be an amazing privilege for everyone to look at you and think that you were the best looking person in the room most of the time. To get all the attention from the guys that you could ever want, and sometimes even make other girls jealous, felt kinda good. But let me tell you the truth about it, it really sucks. More often than not, I felt kinda bad for the girls who weren't as pretty as me. And I also felt bad for having to constantly reject a bunch of guys who wanted to date me. This was especially bad in high school. I got hit on all the time. It honestly became very distracting. I always thought that if I just dated any guy that tried to pick me up, I wouldn't be getting the best guy. So, I just waited until I found a guy that I thought was worthwhile. I spent most of my time with my best friend, Destiny. Me and her were really close. But I remember she almost kind of got jealous when I finally got a boyfriend. Me and this boy, Jake, never actually dated, but we were talking, for lack of a better term. It was one of those situations where people kind of knew that we were somewhat romantically involved. Like, we would talk on the phone at night and sometimes bring each other gifts in school. Things like that. People always blew it out of proportion, but it was what it was. I remember Destiny being very disapproving of Jake. She said that he was a loser and that I could do better than him. He definitely would not have seemed like the first guy I'd gone after. At first look, he isn't the best looking guy in the world, but I think he is really cute. Or, at least I did at the time. I thought this real redeeming quality was that he was the most compassionate guy I'd ever met. Unlike most guys, he actually listened to me when I spoke. I felt like he really heard me, and that was a heck of a lot more than could be said for any other guy that ever tried to date me before. If I'm going to be honest, I felt more heard by him than anyone I've ever met up until that point. The sad part was that Jake had quite a few issues. He wasn't just something of a loner, but he also had this dark and mysterious side that I didn't really know anything about. Even to this day, I don't really know what was wrong with him. I just know that there's something about him that isn't quite right. Looking back, I was extremely naive not to have seen the sign before. He was disliked by so many people, and it wasn't like your standard reaction where people think he's awkward or something. He totally was, but there was something else that was completely off about him. Even my dog had a bad reaction when I brought him to my house one time. And as anyone should know, if a dog doesn't like you, then there is really something wrong with you. Anyway, nothing bad really happened between us until we had a field trip one day. Our entire grade was going to a theme park about 30 minutes away. It was supposed to be a really fun thing. As long as we stayed in small groups of at least 3, we could pretty much go wherever and do whatever we wanted. The idea of not having to be followed around by a teacher all day was extremely enticing. On the day of the field trip, it ended up being me, Jake, and Destiny in a group of 3. He really wanted us to ditch Destiny so we could go and have some fun, but I wasn't about it to do that to my best friend, nor did I really want to do anything sexual on this field trip. Most of the day went by and it was actually pretty fun. There was one point when I had walked by a water slide. Some of the kids who were riding on it splashed some water and got me completely soaked. I had a spare shirt in my book bag. I went into the girls' locker room to change. But this is where things got weird. There was no one in the girls' locker room. I went in there and started to change, and then I heard someone else walk in. I just assumed that it was another girl or a woman. It was a pretty crowded day after all. But no, it was Jake. He started to touch me really inappropriately. I told him that I really wanted to do stuff with him, but just not under these circumstances. He was not getting the hint, and it really started to freak me out. I could feel the bulge in his pants rubbing against my leg. His breath got heavier and heavier, and he got himself really worked up. Finally, I just had to yell at him to stop. I told him that he was really freaking me out, and I just got the rest of my clothes on and walked out, but he didn't follow me. He just let me leave. I stood outside of the girls' locker room for a few minutes, waiting for him to come out, but it was a little while before he did. Probably close to 5 minutes. As you might imagine, I was not excited to go back in there and get him. Destiny also gave me a look when I came out. I told her that Jake was in there, but I didn't tell her what he was doing. She just asked why he was in the girls' locker room at all. I couldn't think of a good excuse. I didn't want to tell her that he was being a total creep with me. Destiny was getting fed up because she wanted to go and buy a pretzel. She knocked on the girls' locker room door and told Jake that he needed to come out right now. We stood there for a few seconds, and all we heard were some strange grunting noises. It was honestly really awkward, and me and Destiny just stood there and looked at each other. Jake finally made one last grunting noise, and a few seconds later, he walked outside. He didn't say a word. He was out of breath, and it was one of the most awkward moments of my life. We told him that we were going to get a pretzel, and he just shook his head. He slowly followed behind us as we made our way to the snack bar. At the time, I don't think I consciously knew it, but now that I'm a little older, I think I have a pretty good idea of what he was doing in there. As you might imagine, that was the end of mine and Jake's little romance. That was the creepiest thing I've ever seen anyone do, and it was so shocking coming from him. I felt like I had spent so much time getting to know him, only to find out that he was even creepier than all the other guys. This happened to me a very long time ago to me and my best friend at the time, who we'll call Steven. Me and Steven had been very rebellious kids growing up. We both came from single mother homes and spent most of our time doing things that we knew we probably shouldn't be doing. When we were in the 7th or 8th grade, I can't remember honestly, we went on a field trip. Now, we live in a small town and it was as boring as you might imagine, but the field trip was to New York City. This was going to be the field trip of our lives, or so we thought. For a couple days leading up to the trip, we talked about all the stuff that we were going to buy, and it was going to be amazing. Nobody was more excited for this trip than we were. When the day for the field trip came, it was actually really bad weather. The rain was pretty bad, and it was also a little foggy for some reason. Suffice to say, the visibility was actually a lot lower than it usually was, which is going to be important later in the story. The teachers told us before we even set foot off the bus that we had to stick with the class. They told us that we could walk with our friends if we wanted to, but that we all had to kind of stay together. Me and Steven thought this was lame. Again, we were those rebellious kinds of kids, so I'm sure you know where this is headed. We actually didn't want to break away from the group right away, but the teachers refused to bring us to the store we wanted to go to. Literally a store for aspiring rappers. Oh, and if you're wondering, yes, I'm out of that phase by now. Steven isn't, but thankfully I am at least. We were convinced that we needed to buy some equipment to launch our rap careers. Looking back, I don't know what we thought we were going to even buy in there. We both had about 20 or 30 bucks each, and all of the recording equipment and stereos and whatnot were easily in the hundreds of dollars. But we weren't the brightest kids, I guess you could say. About 15 minutes later, we hatched our plan secretly. We were going to just sneak off when no one was looking and sneak our way back into the group after we got what we wanted. We figured that because there were so many students on the trip, then we were going to be fine and nobody was going to notice. That was when we did it. We waited until the class was crossing the street, and we just kept walking on the sidewalk we had been on. It took us a very long time to actually find the rap store we wanted to go to, but we eventually found it, and it was as disappointing as you might imagine. Walking into a store when you want to buy everything, but all you can afford is a pack of gum. After making the walk of shame out of the store, we realized that it was time to find our class again. Now, it's probably important to note how obvious it was that we were young. I said that we were in the 7th or 8th grade. We looked even younger than 7th or 8th graders. We probably looked like we could have been the oldest kids in an elementary school. Steven was really short, maybe around 5'2", and I was only a little bit taller than he was. We were also carrying around backpacks, which made it even more obvious that we were kids. So, there we were, walking around the streets of New York City, wandering aimlessly in the hopes of finding our class. This was probably our worst mistake. but we eventually wandered off into one of the sketchier parts of the city. Have you ever gone from a nice part of the city where the tourism happens, and then find yourself in the rundown part of the city where you roll up your windows because you might get shot? It's really a weird experience, and to be so young and to go through it without a car made it especially memorable. Me and Steven had no idea what we were going to do, and that was when a strange man started following us. He was a lot older. He had to have been at least 50 or so. He was very overweight and just gave off one of the creepiest vibes you could ever imagine. He started telling us that he lost his dog and that he needed help finding it. Surprisingly enough, we didn't decline helping him because we were worried. He was sketchy. We just told him that we were too busy looking for our class. Again, another stupid move on our parts. That was when he started getting closer and closer to us. Me and Steven gave each other one good look and knew that we had to run. Especially because this was one of the parts of the city that not many people were around. If this guy really wanted to get to us and do something horrible, he could probably have brought us into an alleyway and done whatever he wanted, and nobody would have known or seen it. By a stroke of luck, we managed to sprint our way back to the populated part of the city. There were a lot of people around, and we looked back around to see if he had followed us. Neither one of us had actually turned around while we were running, but we didn't see him, but we still felt really uneasy. We were leaning against the wall trying to catch our breath when we saw him again. He grabbed Steven by the arm and started yanking on him. I remember being so horrified and not knowing what to do. Thankfully, Steven started screaming at the top of his lungs, and someone intervened and told the creep to let Steven go. He didn't put up much of a fight. He just kind of let Steven go and started walking off as if nothing had happened. We also lucked out because our class just happened to be within an earshot distance of us and heard Steven screaming. I guess one of the teachers had recognized his voice. They got back over with us, and the teachers were as angry as you might imagine. We got in a lot of trouble for breaking away from the group, especially because that really put us in harm's way. I remember one of the male teachers going on a massive rant about the stupidity of our decision. He told us that if we had been a little less lucky that day, we both could have ended up dead. This turned out to be a really big event in my personal life, because that was when I kind of straightened out and stopped acting so rebellious all the time. It's a little sad that something so traumatic was what strained me out, but if it happened to you, I'm sure you would feel the exact same way. The story happened when I was just a little girl. I think I was in the 3rd grade. I remember the day like it was yesterday. In fact, I don't remember very much else about that time period. Anyway, I was your very average Catholic schoolgirl. I was nice to everyone, and I came from a good home. The day that it happened was on a field trip. We went to one of those old historic home kinds of places. It was used as some kind of base during the Revolutionary War or something like that. I don't exactly remember what. I vividly remember making cornbread the old-fashioned way. That was a really fun experience. Makes me kind of sad that one of the most traumatic experiences of my life happened on the same day. What I want you to understand, though, is that the school itself was very small. I was one of 12 students in this class. It was a fairly expensive school, and that's how it was able to operate that way. All things considered, I actually got a really good education there. The thing about coming from a small school is that you have a very tight-knit community of students, parents, and teachers. There were very few security checks or anything like that, especially when it came to something like one of these field trips. Well, I guess one of the boys in the class had an uncle. He just happened to tag along on the field trip along with his nephew, and nobody batted an eye. Like I said, it was a very trusting community of people. At least, until the day this happened. Because I'm pretty sure the rules changed after this. This kid's uncle is very strange. He had a really weird mustache and had these creepy sunglasses that covered his eyes in a way that you couldn't tell where he was looking. He may have been looking in a completely different direction, or he may have been looking right through your eyes. You never really knew, and that became a problem for me early on in the day. I remember when we lined up outside of the buses. There he was, just standing there. It seemed like he was looking right at me, and I remember thinking to myself that it would have been really weird if he was. I immediately looked around to see if I was doing something wrong. Being an innocent kid and all, I assumed that I must have dropped something out of my book bag or something. I didn't though, and I continued standing there, feeling the weight of his gaze on my body. I kept glancing in his direction every couple of seconds to see if he was still looking at me. I really couldn't tell, but I felt like he was. My first impression was that he was going to be one of those overbearing and overprotective helicopter parents that comes along and ruins the trip for everyone. Like he was watching out for one of us to make a mistake so he could call us out on it. That first impression was dead wrong. When we got to the house, we split everyone up into groups. There were maybe 50 or 60 people there all together, and we thought the best way to go about it was to have everyone get into groups of 5. That way, there would be one adult with 4 kids. It worked out perfectly that way. Of course, I ended up with this guy's creepy uncle and his menacing sunglasses. He barely said a word the entire time. I remember looking over at the other groups who had a fun pairing with them. This guy was just weird. He seemed like his mind was somewhere else, and it's only after everything happened that I know exactly where his mind was. It wasn't very long before he did something that crossed many lines. As we were waiting in line to see one of the old or historic exhibits, he started to pet my hair. I remember being so weirded out. I remember looking back at him and giving him one of those, "What the heck are you doing?" kind of facial expressions. He just smiled at me. He did that and a couple of other extremely odd things to me. I don't think any of it crossed the line of sexual assault, but he did some pretty strange touching. Little things like petting my hair, adjusting my skirt, and other stuff like that, which made me extremely uncomfortable. And it was so obvious that he was more interested in me than any other kids. He practically ignored his nephew, and he paid no mind to the other kids in the group. Thankfully for my sake, that was the extent of my day with him. One of the teachers caught on to this very strange behavior and pulled this guy aside. He then claimed that there was an emergency at the mechanic shop he worked in and had to leave immediately. Of course, I know in retrospect now that he was probably threatened with some kind of legal action. It's been years since all of this went down, and I found something out very recently that truly shocked me. Well, I still keep in touch with that one friend of mine. I was talking to him on Facebook, and we were reminiscing about our days in Catholic school. I asked him about his uncle because I randomly remembered it. He said that his uncle was in jail for a few more months, and he was actually about to be released that week. I asked him what he was in for. What he proceeded to tell me chilled me to the bone. I guess his uncle had been caught with some child pornography. It was truly disturbing. I don't think he ever acted on his desires. I'm pretty sure they would have locked him up for good and thrown away the key if he did. But just the thought that someone who was a confirmed predator had touched me like that as a child makes me feel sick. So yeah, moral of the story is, no matter how small or close-knit your little community is, there is always the potential for bad actors to enter the scene and forever change the trust amongst everyone else.